It was an ordinary Friday night, and three best friends, Lucy, Mark, and Danny, gathered at Lucy's house for a sleepover. They were restless and bored, craving something thrilling to break the monotony of their usual games. Lucy remembered a story her older brother had told her, one that sent a chill down her spine. She asked, "Have you guys ever heard of the vanishing game?" In a low, conspiratorial whisper. "If you play it, you have to follow the rules exactly, and if you don't, they say you disappear forever." The boys laughed nervously, but Lucy's face remained deadly serious, a warning in her eyes. Lucy pulled out an old creased piece of paper covered in strange symbols and instructions. The first rule on the paper was clear. They had to play it at exactly midnight. As the clock struck midnight, they dimmed the lights and traced a large chalk door on the living room floor. They knocked 3 times in unison, each thud echoing through the house, and then sat in a circle around the chalk door, waiting. A heavy silence settled over the room, making their skin prickle as if something unseen was watching them. The air seemed colder, and shadows in the corners stretched and swayed, as if the darkness had begun to move on its own. Nothing happened at first, and Mark started to laugh, but his laugh cut off abruptly. A faint childlike whisper filled the room, saying, "Who wants to play?" The 3 friends froze, their faces pale in the dim light, realizing the voice was not theirs. It sounded like a little girl, soft and distant, echoing from somewhere beyond the chalk door. Danny bolted for the light switch, but it wouldn't turn on, no matter how many times he tried. They were locked in darkness, surrounded by shadows that seemed to be closing in around them. The voice echoed again, louder this time, asking, "Who wants to play hide and seek?" The shadows in the corners grew darker, stretching toward them as if alive. The kids looked at each other, terrified, noticing something off in their reflections in the window. Lucy's reflection was staring back, but her mouth was moving, whispering words they couldn't hear. Danny and Mark's reflections were staring straight ahead, eyes wide as if trapped in the glass. Desperate, Danny ran back to the chalk door and tried to rub it out with his sleeve, but the chalk lines wouldn't smear, remaining clear and solid despite his attempts. Danny looked different, his eyes hollow and distant, as if he was only half there. Lucy and Mark reached out, but before they could touch him, Danny vanished, leaving only a faint gasp. Lucy and Mark were left alone, staring at each other in shock, struggling to understand what had just happened. A low, chilling voice whispered from the darkness, "I'm what's left of those who didn't finish the game." Lucy's hands shook as she reached for Mark's hand, but instead of his skin, she touched something cold and slick. She looked down, gasping in horror. A pale, bony hand was reaching up from the chalk door. The hand's grip tightened around her wrist, pulling her closer to the chalk door. In the distance, she could hear Danny's voice, faint and desperate, calling, "Lucy, help me! I'm lost!" Mark grabbed her other arm, trying to pull her free, his face twisted with fear and determination. The darkness around them thickened, swallowing the room inch by inch, and she could feel herself slipping into it. The chalk door seemed to shimmer, like a portal opening, pulling them into an endless void. Lucy screamed, "Close the door!" her voice raw with terror. Mark scrambled to erase the chalk lines, rubbing them with his sleeve until only faint smudges remained. Instantly, the hand released her, and the darkness faded, retreating back into the corners of the room. The lights flickered back on, and everything looked normal. But as they glanced around, a sickening realization hit them. Danny was still gone. Days passed, and then weeks, but there was no sign of Danny. His family and the police searched, but he had vanished without a trace. Months later, Lucy lay in bed, trying to forget that terrible night. A soft knock came at her window, barely audible but chillingly familiar. Slowly, she turned toward the window, and her heart stopped. Standing in the darkness outside was Danny, his face pale and blank, his eyes staring straight through her. Danny whispered through the glass, his voice echoing just like the shadows had, "Lucy, who wants to play?" The night was thick with fog, so heavy that even the moon seemed to disappear behind it, casting the small town into an unnatural darkness. Emily gripped the steering wheel tighter as her car's headlights struggled to cut through the haze, illuminating only a few feet of the winding road ahead. She was alone driving home after a late shift at the diner when a faint rhythmic thumping began under her car. She pulled over, heart pounding, and stepped out onto the empty road. The forest loomed on either side, silent and still, as if waiting. She circled around her car, expecting to find a flat tire, but everything was intact. Just as she was about to get back inside, she noticed something. A single small handprint on the back window. Emily froze, staring at it. She hadn't seen anyone in hours, and her car had been parked right outside the diner, where nobody else was around. She brushed it off, telling herself it was just some kid's handprint from earlier, and climbed back in. But as she turned the key in the ignition, her radio crackled, and a child's voice, soft and almost pleading, whispered, "Help me." Every hair on her neck stood up. She twisted the dials, turning the volume down, but the voice grew louder, clearer. "I'm cold. Please, help me." She slammed the radio off, breathing hard, her hands shaking on the wheel. Just then, the fog outside began to shift, revealing a figure standing in the middle of the road, a child barefoot, staring at her with hollow, dark eyes. In a panic, Emily pressed her foot to the gas, veering around the child, but as she passed, she felt a cold, skeletal hand grip her shoulder from the back seat. She screamed, swerving the car onto the shoulder, the force of her turn slamming her against the door. She glanced back, wild-eyed, but there was no one there, just the empty back seat, shadows spilling across the upholstery. She was about to call the police, her fingers trembling on her phone, when she heard the soft creak of a car door opening. Her own door was slowly opening from the outside. Terrified, she looked out, but only saw the dense fog. Then she felt it, a cold breath on her neck, the faintest whisper. "Why did you leave me?" She bolted, running into the forest, branches clawing at her as she stumbled through the underbrush. Behind her, she heard light, echoing footsteps, pattering softly over the leaves. No matter how fast she ran, the footsteps stayed close, never quite catching up, but never falling behind. Suddenly, the trees parted, and she found herself at an old cemetery she'd never seen before. Rows of crooked headstones jutted from the earth like broken teeth. In the center stood a single gravestone, freshly carved. Against her will, she felt herself pulled toward it, each step heavy, her heart drumming louder with every inch she covered. She looked down at the name carved into the stone, and her blood ran cold. It was her own name, the date of death marked, tonight. A soft giggle echoed through the air, and she turned, coming face to face with the child from the road. But now up close, she could see its hollow eyes, its mouth twisted in a cruel smile. The child raised one skeletal finger and pointed behind her. Slowly, Emily turned, only to find herself staring at her own body, lying cold and still on the ground next to her car, her own eyes staring sightlessly into the fog. The last thing she heard before darkness consumed her was that child's voice, whispering in her ear, "You left me, but now you'll stay."